All right, I want to continue tonight with our, where we left off a couple of weeks ago with our examination of the Protestant Church, okay, the Western Church in the line of the Protestant tradition as it broke away from Rome into the modern era. All right, so we're working our way through the church from about the Civil War into the 20th century. We're just looking at different ways that American Protestant Christianity moved out of that period of time. We've already seen a couple of these different things. We've seen the rise of liberalism. We've seen the response of fundamentalism. We have seen even the response of the Catholic Church. We looked even before at some of the Protestant thinkers into the 20th century who began to rethink the age of reason after the First Great Awakening. So we've started with that, and so tonight I want to continue in that realm by talking about what I refer to as some of the great preachers of the age in the various evangelistic movements of the 20th century. Now, when I say great preachers, okay, I am not referring to the greatest preachers per se. When I mean great, I'm using great in the sense of how these particular men were used within the movement I want to talk about. Those who are notable within the framework of the evangelistic movement and the role of evangelicalism within Western American church. If I wanted to do a series on the greatest preachers, the names I'm going to include tonight would not necessarily be on the list. I mean, we'd be talking about guys like Spurgeon and the Doctor, Martin Lloyd-Jones and Ian Murray and James Boyce and R.C. Stott and John Piper, MacArthur, Chuck Swindoll, Adrian Rogers, John Stott, W.A. Criswell, and a whole list of others. Some of them were not Calvinists, I recognize in the list, but nonetheless they were great preachers and preached the gospel. So what I'm talking about tonight are men who fall into this movement I want to talk about, because that's really what we've been dealing with, is the movements that have been flowing through Western Protestant Christianity since the days of the Civil War. All right. So what I need to do then is remind you first of the reality of evangelicalism. Okay, evangelicalism, you remember, became a significant, dare I say, a dominant part of Western Protestant Christianity, particularly in America. You remember that evangelicalism was that pietistic movement that began around the mid-1930s during the First Great Awakening, in which there became an entirely different focus as to the reality of the gospel, the personal experience of the individual as the center of the gospel proclamation. It moved from being sort of a traditional reality to being a personal reality. Sorry about that, Jake. I was thinking about that during my prayer that I forgot to turn that on, and then I forgot. So, okay. So, evangelicalism evangelicalism was spawned during the First Great Awakening. And you'll remember that that there were several key characteristics of evangelicalism, right? Conversionism, the requirement of a personal conversion. There was a sense of biblicism where evangelicalism focused on the Bible at the center of itself, even though that flowed out of Protestant thinking all the way back to the Reformation, but it became heightened during the days of the rise of evangelicalism. The Christocentrism, the focus on the cross, the focus on the elements of Jesus' death and burial in particularly. And then finally, and most importantly for our discussion, the activism that also became a part of evangelicalism. And activism in this case became the idea within evangelicalism that it was important for you as a follower of Christ to evangelize others, to go out and actively pursue other followers of Christ by proclaiming your faith. Those became fundamental characteristics of the movement of evangelicalism. And it's true even to today in large swaths of evangelicalism. So it is this activism that comes to deeply affect evangelicalism in the late 19th and into the 20th century in one particular way. All right, and that's what we're going to focus on tonight. One particular way is what I'm calling the evangelistic movement of American Protestant evangelicalism. The evangelistic movement. All right? When we talk about the evangelistic movement, what we're talking about is the rise of the evangelist as a particular position, I'll use that word for now, position in the church, such that such men in that role became, in many ways, what could be best described as professional evangelists. Okay, they became men whose role was to go out beyond the church into the world, taking the role of an evangelist into the secular world, into the regular world, okay? And we're going to talk tonight about two of the greatest evangelists that fall into this movement, that define this movement, okay? Now, ironically, both of them's first name is Billy. The first is a man by the name of Billy Sunday. How many of you are familiar with Billy Sunday? You know who he is? Okay. Billy Sunday lived from 1862 until 1935. Okay, so you see he's crossing over that barrier between the 19th and the 20th centuries. Billy Sunday was, I guess you would call him a pioneer in the evangelistic campaign and the idea of full-time evangelistic ministry. Sunday was born near Ames, Iowa, to a bricklayer who had recently emigrated from Germany through Pennsylvania. His father died just 4 months after enlisting in the Iowa 23rd Voluntary Infantry in 1862, 5 weeks after Billy's birth, after William's birth. His mother then, left destitute without a husband, moved into her mother's home, her parents' home, with her 4 children at that point. At the age of 10, Billy was sent off to an orphanage in Glenwood, Iowa, and later to one in Davenport, Iowa. And it was at the orphanage that Billy was properly educated with basically what today we would call an 8th grade education. And then his natural athleticism came out. It was discovered that he had a natural athletic talent. In 1883, at the age of 21, Sunday was signed to the Chicago White Stockings, forerunner of the Chicago White Sox. But in 1888, he was sold, just 5 years later, he was sold to the Pittsburgh Alleghenies. And then in 1890, he was sent off to the Phillies in Philadelphia. Now, Billy Sunday was an average baseball player. He didn't have a great batting average. He was just an average player, but he was extraordinarily popular with the fans. He had a personality. He interacted with the fans at the baseball park when he was there. He wasn't one of those snobbish baseball players that would have anything to do with the fans. He would actually get involved with the fans, and he was very popular, and he was renowned for his speed, particularly between the bases and in the outfield. That's what basically kept him as a baseball player. It wasn't his batting average, it was his speed. In 1886 or 1887, we're not sure which one, Billy heard the gospel through a street preaching group and became a believer after attending Jefferson Park Presbyterian Church in Chicago, Illinois. In 1891, just a few years later, Sunday turned down a permanent baseball contract, which would have paid him significant money, and joined the YMCA and was paid $83 a month to be employed. You remember that the YMCA was established after the Industrial Revolution to address the rampant biblical illiteracy and lack of discipleship that was taking place in the inner cities. That one of the outgrowths of the Second Great Awakening was the establishment of the YMCA. Well, Billy Sunday got himself a job with the YMCA, and for the next 3 years, he spent his time visiting the sick, praying and counseling the troubled and the suicidal, and visited saloons to invite people to evangelistic meetings. In 1893, Sunday became the full-time assistant to a man by the name of J. Wilbur Chapman, who at that time, the late 19th century, was one of the best-known evangelists in the United States. Chapman Chapman is really, in many ways, the forerunner of Billy Sunday. I just don't have time tonight to do a biography of Chapman and get in all I need to get in here. We could, however, really attribute the evangelistic movement I'm talking about to Chapman. Although Chapman is not going to stay on the scene for too terribly long once Sunday comes along. So Sunday becomes his assistant, his advance man for Chapman. He was employed, as I said, as the advance man for Chapman. He would go to the next city that Chapman was going to go to, and he would organize prayer meetings and choirs and other details of things that would be needed for Chapman to come to town and do his revival meeting when he got there. So Sunday found himself as the lead guy going to the next town and getting things going. And if you know anything about this movement, you know there's always the need for a massive front-end movement to make these revivalistic meetings come off. So in many ways, Chapman was mentored and molded into Chapman mentored and molded Sunday into an evangelist himself. He gave him opportunities to preach. He actually gave him advice on how to preach. He actually would critique some of his sermons and say, you could do this better, you could do that better, and so in so many ways, Chapman used his skills as an orator and a preacher in a public venue to teach Sunday how to do this, how to use his oration effectively. And in 1896 then, when Chapman returned to the pastorate, gave up the full-time evangelism job, Sunday then struck out on his own. It was at that point that Sunday decided that he could develop his own ministry. So for the next 12 years, from about 1896 to roughly 1908, he preached in about 70 different towns and communities throughout Iowa and Illinois. He went from town to town preaching in those places. And he used his reputation as a former baseball player to generate advertising for his meetings. That makes sense. So he was a very popular baseball player. He would go around using that reputation to help sell people to come. Hey, come see Billy Sunday, the baseball player. He's going to be over here at this place on Sunday. Come and see him. And he would use that as a way of convincing people to come out and see him. By 1905, some 7 years later, or actually 9 years later, he had developed a ministry with enough money to hire his own advance men, and began insisting, in fact, that the locals in whatever town he was going to visit would build their own tabernacles to host him. Instead of him coming to town and pitching a tent, he would actually insist that they build him a building for him to come and preach in. The floors would be typically covered in sawdust. They would build a building and cover the floors with sawdust to help dampen the noise and the distractions, particularly of the children in the services. Sunday despised children in the services. They were always interrupting him, and so he never figured out how to preach around them like some of us have. And so he had them put sawdust on the floor to sort of dampen the sound in the building. Because, if you build a big wooden box and then stand in the middle of it, it's going to echo, and any bit of noise is going to easily be amplified in such a place. The sawdust became a moniker for his evangelistic meetings. They were called the Sawdust Trail, where he would go from place to place. By 1908, under his wife's leadership, by the way, he and his wife had a very on and off again relationship as husband and wife, given that he was gone so much of the time. Eventually, she figured out that the best way to keep their marriage strong was for her to go with him. So she started to work the leadership of his ministry. By 1908, the Sunday ministry had become a nationally renowned phenomenon. And by 1917, they had a paid staff of 26 people. Included in this ministry was a man by the name of Homer Rodeheaver. He was a song leader and music director who traveled with Billy for almost 20 years, alongside a woman by the name of Virginia Asher, who led the women's ministries alongside what Billy was doing. Now that will sound familiar. Pay attention to that. Now, Billy preached what you would today call fire and brimstone sermons, okay? Fire and brimstone sermons in which he focused heavily on damnation and hell. His primary message was on the reality of hell and how everybody in the room is going there and you're damned to that place. And so he would preach that kind of a sermon, doing so with great fervor. In fact, he would use his natural athleticism to run back and forth across the stage, picking up chairs and smashing them against things. And he was very demonstrative in his preaching. I mean, he was very much different than me, I mean, in that sense, right? He was generally trying to, as he said, quote, drive sinners into the fold, unquote, through the use of great emotionalism and descriptions of the kinds of sins that he was condemning. He would stand in the pulpit and describe in vivid detail the kinds of sexual sins that he was preaching against, to the point where his opponents would say that his descriptions were often very raw and disgusting in describing such sins in particular. And similarly, when he got around to worldly amusements and the use of alcohol and other moral failings that he saw in people, he would quite literally go in the pulpit and describe the kinds of sins that he was condemning. It was said that at each of his crusades, at least one gentleman in the crowd would faint from the descriptions that he would bring of the kinds of things that he was preaching against. Now, he was hardly a polished preacher. As I said, he had an 8th grade education at best. He never went to seminary. He learned his craft from Chapman, plus his natural ability to speak, along with his athleticism. So he put all of that together to develop a methodology. As I said, he used crude slang to get across his ideas. So he was not what you would call an expository preacher. He was a fire and brimstone, emotionally appealing man trying to convince people to repent and be saved. He was an evangelical in the sense that he did believe in the preaching of the gospel, of course, but he had strong fundamentalist tendencies. Remember, the fundamentalist movement was very much in action at this point. You remember 3-4 weeks ago, we talked about the fundamentalist movement and how it started after the at the Second Great Awakening as a response to liberalism's rise, and it tried to push the church in the opposite direction. Well, he went with that push, and so his fundamentalist tendencies would come out in his preaching. He affirmed the basic points of Protestant theology, but he was careful and went out of his way to not criticize Catholics or Unitarians. He was not a Calvinist, not by any stretch of the imagination. He preached a very synergistic view of salvation between God and man. Although he never went to seminary, he was well versed in the Bible. He could quote great sections of it very effectively in his sermons, and he was also well read in other works. He had a library full of books that were discovered after his death, and there was much writing in the margins of many of the books as he had read them and taken notes along the way. It is estimated that Billy Sunday, between roughly 1896 and 1930, preached to 100 million people face to face. Now, many of the same people again and again and again coming to his revivals, of course, but it's been estimated that he had the opportunity to preach the gospel to 100 million faces, with about 1.2 million people accepting his invitation. At the end of his sermons, he would typically ask for a response, and about 1.2 million people accepted his invitation. He estimated in his own words at the end of his life that he had preached about 20,000 sermons during the course of his evangelistic career. I've got a little over 1,000 on my website. I've got a long ways to go. In fact, his musical sidekick, Roadheaver, complained that by 1927, his invitations had become so general that they were utterly meaningless. Sunday's popularity began to wane dramatically after World War I. His health declined and his family suffered a series of tragedies. Ironically, his 3 sons engaged in many of the sins he preached against. And he paid blackmail to several women to keep the scandals quiet. His only daughter died of MS, and his oldest son committed suicide after Billy and his wife had rescued him from financial ruin as a result of the Great Depression in 1933. In early 1935, Billy suffered a heart attack, but he continued to preach. His last sermon, preached just 6 days before he died, was entitled, ironically, "What Must I Do to Be Saved?" The life of Billy Sunday is a microcosm of this movement that begins in evangelicalism, this push towards the professional evangelist going out and doing revival meetings. In fact, Billy Sunday is probably the first great professional evangelist with a paid ministry, paving the way for a new understanding of evangelist, the office of evangelist within evangelicalism itself. Okay? Billy Sunday is typically recognized by most historians as the granddaddy of the professional evangelist. Which leads us, of course, to the other Billy Graham, who in many ways has a very similar story. Different, but yet similar in some ways. Billy Graham lived, of course, from 1918 to 2018. He only died a few years ago. It is probably a true statement to say that while Billy Sunday may have been the first great professional evangelist, Billy Graham is probably the greatest professional evangelist that has ever lived. Born in the downstairs bedroom of a farmhouse near Charlotte, North Carolina, Billy Graham was the eldest of 4 children. As a child, he loved to read, especially books about Tarzan. He would hang from a tree in the yard and make the famous Tarzan yell. And his father credited this as leading him into the ministry. He had such a way, apparently. Graham attended Bob Jones College before it became Bob Jones University. But he left because, now get this, he found it too legalistic to stay there. He transferred instead to the Florida Bible Institute in Temple Terrace, Florida. And he writes in his own autobiography that it was at the 18th green of the Temple Terrace Golf and Country Club that he came to hear the call to go and to preach. He had already preached his first sermon at Bostwick Baptist, but it was on the 18th green, the end of a round of golf, that he felt the Lord was calling him to something greater than just a single church ministry of preaching. In 1939, he was ordained by a group of Southern Baptist ministers at Peniel Baptist in Palatka, I think I pronounced that, Palatka, Florida, somewhere nearby. He went to Wheaton College. Graham, when he went there, first wrestled with the idea of the infallibility of the Scriptures, which was a subject that had bothered him for years. He wrote about it in his autobiography. But he resolved that difficulty with the Scriptures, that the Scriptures were infallible. And it became a part of Billy Graham's demeanor. If you know Billy Graham's preaching at all, you know that he would treat the Bible as an infallible statement into the lives of people. Well, it's through his time at Wheaton that this became a part of his thinking process. While he was there at Wheaton, he was invited to preach at a church called the United Gospel Tabernacle. Apparently, he was good enough, they asked him to come back. In fact, multiple times they asked him to come back until he eventually accepted, through the advice of a friend, the pastorate of that particular church. So he became the pastor of that church sometime during his time at Wheaton. He graduated from Wheaton in 1943 with a degree in anthropology, which I also find deeply ironic. Later that year, Graham took over the radio ministry of a man by the name of Torrey Johnson. He had a radio broadcast called Songs in the Night, which went on in the night on AM radio stations across the country. He ran out of money, couldn't find support. Johnson did. And so under the financial support of his own congregation, Billy Graham took over that radio ministry and restarted it again the very next year. under his own banner, still using the same title, Songs in the Night. But he hired a man by the name of George Beverly Shea to be his radio ministry. If you remember, George Beverly Shea was the one who would sing at every Billy Graham crusade and stayed with him, loyal to him, until he died, even before Billy did. In 1948, Graham became the president of Northwestern Bible College in Minneapolis, now known as Northwestern University in Minneapolis, just 6 blocks south, I should say, of Bethel University, where I graduated from that school. You remember Northwestern. I don't remember if you vaguely remember this from a previous lecture, that Northwestern had been developed as one of those fundamentalist schools, teaching fundamentalist doctrines. He remained as the president of Northwestern Bible College until 1952, so just a period of 6 years. He left because he really wanted to be a chaplain in the armed forces. He believed that was the direction that the Lord was calling him, and so he applied for a commission to be a chaplain, but came down with a case of mumps, and his commission was rejected. So he went back to Florida to recuperate from the mumps, and while he was there, he ran across a representative of a new group that had begun called Youth for Christ. And he took a full-time evangelist position for this new organization. Much as Billy Sunday had joined the YMCA and became a full-time evangelist, which is what launched him eventually into his professional evangelist career, it is this hire here for Youth for Christ that did the same for Billy Graham. He began to travel throughout the country, preaching as an itinerant evangelist. His first great crusade was held in September of 1947 in Grand Rapids, Michigan. By the way, September of 1947 is exactly the point in time that Calvary Baptist Church in Phillipsburg was started. When he was there in Grand Rapids, about 6,000 people attended his first crusade. And he began to refer to these revivals as crusades after this point. We can't prove the following statement, but we think it's true, that he named it after the medieval Christian forces who conquered Jerusalem, the church storming the gates of hell. That's why he started using the term to describe these instead of revivals, using them as crusades, because he really believed that what he and George Beverly Shea were doing was taking the gospel and going out into the world and attacking the gates of hell, just like the ancient crusaders had done in medieval times. In 1949, just a couple of years later, Graham preached a series of revival meetings in Los Angeles. While he was there, he would set up great big circus tents in parking lots of what were then starting as shopping malls. They were really more strip malls in our day, but he would go to large parking lots and set up a big tent, and he would invite people to come. Well, this particular crusade in 1949 caught the attention of the national media. It caught specifically the attention of a man who had a whole series of newspapers up and down the West Coast, a man by the name of Randolph Hearst. Randolph Hearst was well known for his yellow journalism, his sensationalism that he put in his newspapers in order to try to sell newspapers. Hearst believed that the way to sell newspapers wasn't just to tell boring stories about the news, but rather to embellish the stories and to make them more sensational, or the forerunner of CNN. He did this. Hearst heard of this crusade and began writing about it in his paper, sensationalizing it even. The crusade was originally planned for 3 weeks. It went 8 weeks in length, given the number of people that were coming. And it was this event that rocketed Graham into the national spotlight, specifically with the conversion, and I'm putting that in scare quotes on purpose, the conversion of several Hollywood celebrities, showbiz folks who apparently came to faith under Billy Graham's leading. This would rocket him into the national spotlight. In fact, by the end of his life, Graham had preached more than 400 different crusades in over 185 countries. His style is best described, his rhetoric and preaching style are best described by some as mesmerizing. Thousands would often stream down at the end of his sermons to respond to the so-called invitation at the end. When he preached in Moscow in 1992, 155,000 people came to the crusade, and it is estimated that a quarter of all of the people that were there came down at the time of the invitation. While Graham was at Moody, he was at Wheaton, he learned something from a guy by the name of Moody, Dwight L. Moody. He learned his preaching style from Moody. Moody's preaching style was to preach emphatic sermons focusing specifically on the elements of the gospel call, specific parts of the gospel call. The reality of sin, the need for change, the cross of Christ, and a call to respond to an invitation. Now, if you've noticed, those four align with the four characteristics of evangelicalism I gave you a little while ago. He focused on simple messages of sin, change, Christ, and response. That was every one of his sermons. You could take a typical Billy Graham sermon, although it might have a different introduction and use a different passage of Scripture. It fundamentally looked the same, one after another after another. But something changed in the mid-1950s, and historians have noted it. In fact, even his autobiographer noted this, that sometime in the mid-1950s, Graham began to shift towards a more ecumenical theology. The word ecumenical, as you know, means coming together. So he began to preach along the lines of a shift from, within his preaching, a shift from separation from sin to an accommodation and cooperation with those who did not necessarily share the fundamentals of the faith. He began to see that the way to draw larger crowds was to preach in a way that you were attractive even to people who did not necessarily embrace the fundamentals you were attempting to preach. In other words, to preach to a liberal audience, or to even have liberals on the stage with him who would testify, or Catholics on the stage, or other non-moderate or moderates that were not along the lines of the fundamentalists, mainline preachers even that would come along with him. Somewhere during the 50s, this shift began to take place and people began to notice it. In fact, Graham was going to do a crusade in London. He had planned a crusade in London, and he wanted Dr. Martin Lloyd-Jones to be his sponsor there, because Lloyd-Jones had a large following of Protestant Christians there that he was preaching to. Lloyd-Jones was a well-known and still a deeply respected Reformed preacher of the day, and he had a great following, and so Graham was hoping that Lloyd-Jones would front him the crusade, that Lloyd-Jones would get up and what's the word I'm looking for? Well, not warm up the crowd, but he would be the one to sort of tell the world, hey, Graham's coming and you need to go. Represent, or something to that effect. Yeah, it's not the word I'm looking for, but in any case, Lloyd-Jones and Graham sat down to have a conversation about it. And apparently over the course of a 3-hour meeting, Lloyd-Jones said to Graham, I will front your crusade if you will not put on the platform any liberals or any Catholics. If you're willing to do that, I'm willing to front your ministry. And Graham refused. And Lloyd-Jones says, okay, you're on your own. I'm not going to help you. Now, Graham went ahead with his crusade nonetheless, but Lloyd-Jones spoke against it all throughout London about what Graham was doing, because he was seen in him. And then we have in fact, there's a quote I didn't write down from Lloyd-Jones that he later said that he was, from Ian Murray, who was Lloyd-Jones's autobiographer, later said that Jones had said something to the effect that he was deeply disappointed that Graham was now preaching things that were no longer consistent with the fundamentals of the gospel that he once claimed to hold. In fact, in an interview in 1997 with Robert Schuller, We'll come back to that name in a minute. Graham said the following in the interview, quote, "I think everybody that loves or knows Christ, whether they are conscious of it or not, they are members of the body of Christ. They may not know the name of Jesus, but they know in their hearts that they need something they do not have, and they turn to the only light they have, and I think they are saved, and they are going to be with us in heaven." And the context of that was Muslim nations. Graham was roundly criticized for that comment. Now, he tried to backtrack it later, arguing that he still believed that the gospel needed to be preached, but the words were already there, and it seemed to match up with the ecumenism that he was promoting from the stage in many of his crusades. It is rumored, I think this is apocryphal, but it is rumored that even Graham himself, at the end of his life, admitted that only about 5% of all of the people that went down in one of his gospel invitations was actually saved. That even he admitted that to be the case. Although Graham did urge those who came to Christ to join a local church, his ministry did little in the way of following up to see if any of them were actually being discipled. Just push the up button, Roger, until it gets up high enough and it'll stop. I'm not sure why it's running as much as it is. But there's icicles hanging from some of these people's face. The Billy Graham Association did very little to actually disciple the people who had come to these invitations. It was one of the strongest criticism that was ever leveled against his crusades. In 1950, Graham founded the Billy Graham Evangelistic Association, which was at the time headquartered in Minneapolis, Minnesota. And it moved to Charlotte in 1999. And as a part of the Billy Graham Evangelistic Associations, there were a number of ministries that were launched from it. The Hour of Decision, a weekly radio broadcast from 1950 to 2016, was a part of the Billy Graham Evangelistic Association. The My Answer newspaper column was distributed by Tribune Content Agency around the United States, written by Billy. Decision Magazine was the official magazine of the association, published by the association from Minneapolis. And Billy Graham, along with Carl F.H. Henry, founded Christianity Today in 1956, the flagship evangelical news magazine of the late 20th century, which has now gone completely off the rails in terms of what it used to be. Just as a personal aside here, I said the Billy Graham Association was located in Minneapolis. It was actually downtown Minneapolis, and I took a job with a company called Advanced Control Systems in 1981 as a programmer, and we used hardware similar to what Billy Graham Association was using. Sometime in 1982, I don't remember exactly when, someone from the association called us and asked if we could help them to retrieve a mailing list from a hard drive that was failing for them. And I said, yeah, bring it out. And so he brought it out, and I worked for a whole night, but I retrieved that mailing list for him. It had about 500,000 names on it with addresses, zip codes, telephone numbers. It would have been horrible to have lost it. So I feel responsible in some way for Billy Graham. Now, of course, we know, and I could do a whole lot more about Billy Graham at this point. We know, of course, that he went on to become one of the most influential evangelicals of the late 20th century. He had a number of roles in his life, right? He was often referred to as America's pastor or America's patriarch, or more particular, America's evangelical pastor. He had the opportunity to meet every president from Harry Truman to Barack Obama. He was very close with Richard Nixon. He had the opportunity to meet a number of popes during the course of his life as well. I mean, he was, well, dare I say, well known. I mean, who in America hasn't heard of Billy Graham, even in the 21st century amongst the Gen Z folks, right? Billy Graham was the greatest professional evangelist of the church age. And I say, notice I'm using the term professional evangelist, okay, because we're talking about a new role that appears within evangelicalism. It's a role outside of the church of an office being held by an individual outside of the church working to proclaim the gospel. So we use the term evangelist. It was Graham who had the single largest professional evangelistic ministry that has ever been launched in the history of Protestantism. It bar none. Of course, he was able to use all the technologies of the 20th century to accomplish much of that as well. But Sunday and Graham paved the way for the church, the evangelical church, to recognize the evangelist as an office. In many ways, evangelicals consider the office of evangelist, or the role of evangelist, to actually be an office in the body of Christ, alongside of the two regular offices of elder and deacon. There are many men who go into what you would call professional evangelistic ministry and call themselves an evangelist. Well, it's Sunday and Graham who are responsible, to a large measure, for this new professional class to appear at this time. In fact, I manage a website for an organization called Come International Baptist Ministries. It's a fundamentalist ministry of itinerant preachers, evangelists that go out to churches and lead revivals or other training events. Now, none of the men would agree with my philosophy or theology or any of those sorts of things, but I don't discriminate on that basis. I mean, if they could preach the gospel, good for them. But you will notice it's a group of men who call themselves evangelists. They're using the term to describe themselves, and they see themselves as going out of the church so that this work is being done outside. Now, these men are working inside of churches, but Billy Graham didn't preach in churches, did he? He preached in stadiums. Now, yes, he would preach in churches once in a while, but when you think of Billy Graham, you think of his preaching in outdoor stadiums, you think of him preaching in places other than the church. Well, that was true of Sunday, who had little tabernacles built, as well as Graham and his particular ministry. See how that was being done. My good friend, Dr. Kimbrell, up in Laurel, Mississippi, has a PhD from New Orleans Baptist Theological Seminary. And he has the first doctorate from that school with a doctorate in evangelism. Dr. Carey has a doctorate in evangelism, and he wrote his doctoral thesis on the question, is there an office of evangelist? And his conclusion through his thesis is no. There is no biblical office called evangelist. What you see in Ephesians chapter 4 is not an office but a role. And that role can be taken on by anybody. Remember when Paul says that God has given to the church apostles and prophets and evangelists and teachers and pastors. Paul's not making the statement that this is an office, but rather simply a role that can be taken by anybody in the church. Well, my point is that there's actually, what actually happened was, through the influence of men like Sunday and Graham, there actually became a new way of thinking about this term, in the sense that there are people, most Baptists, I would argue, think that this is a perfectly legitimate title to be given to a person who takes on the role of evangelism in the world. I mean, he's an evangelist. That's his job. And they think that's an acceptable understanding of the term. And Dr. Carey spent his doctrinal thesis indicating that there is no such office implied in the Bible, that the term evangelist was used as a temporary function of the local church under its direction, and that popular ministries are never to be confused or overshadow the work of the local preaching of the gospel unto salvation. Unfortunately, there's many people who believe that Billy Graham was more important than the local preacher in the local church, but the Bible argues the exact opposite of that. Dr. Carey argued. So this movement that starts, you see, with Billy Sunday in the late 19th and then into the early 20th century, and then gets picked up by guys like Billy Graham and continues on. And they're not the only two, evangelists. There were many others. But those are the two guys that are the most famous of all of them. That starts a movement. It starts a movement within evangelicalism of this idea of activism. And I would argue that it created one unfortunate side effect, and that unfortunate side effect was to lead the typical evangelical to believe that the responsibility for preaching the gospel and evangelizing the lost was the professional evangelist, not their own. As though you and I, as ordinary people in a church, it's not our responsibility to save people. That's the responsibility of guys like Billy Graham or the pastor of a church. The unfortunate side effect of the movement was to remove the responsibility of evangelism, which was the very function of evangelicalism itself, within the heart of the personal experience of the individual, take it away from the individual and hand it to the professional. And I can speak to that quite clearly because the vast majority of synergistic Baptists that go to a Baptist church have never, ever spoken in such a way as to bring about the conversion of another. They've never even tried. It's not my job. My job is just to get them to church and the pastor will do the job. Or I will just get them to the Billy Graham crusade and that will save them. That's one of the terrible side effects of that. But another of the side effects of the evangelistic movement was the rise not only of the evangelist, but of the televangelist. You knew I had to go there, right? Sunday and Graham, as widely popular evangelists, paved the way for a whole new form of evangelist to enter the picture with the age of television. Specifically, someone who, like Graham, develops an evangelistic ministry outside the local church, but in this case uses the medium of television as the means of building an audience. This movement took off in the 70s, 60s and 70s because it was easy. It doesn't take much effort to do this. Now, TV, of course, was not ubiquitous in American households until the mid-1960s, potentially a little later even, when you get to ubiquitous TVs. But I grew up with a TV at home. Now, okay, we grew up with a TV. It had 3 channels, no such thing as a remote control. I was the child in the house, which meant I was the remote control. So my dad said, change the channel. I had to walk over and change the channel. I had to adjust the rabbit ears. And if the president was on, your night was out the door. It wasn't ubiquitous in American households until the 1960s. So the rise of the televangelist did not occur until the latter half of the 20th century. It comes a little bit later. We find it mostly in the 70s and then into the 80s. And due to great scandal, a rising tide against Christianity in the United States, and the turn away from TV as the primary medium of the modern age, the televangelist has greatly diminished in influence in the present. So it was a movement. It went on for a while, reached its heyday. I'll give you a couple of names here in a minute to describe the heyday, and then began to shrink. To today, vast majorities of people have never even heard of most of the televangelists. Many of them aren't even on the airwaves anymore. Some of them still are on, rare channels on DirecTV, but they're really not, they don't have a whole lot of influence in the world, with a few exceptions, and you'll see why as we go through this. So let me give you some examples of some of the most notable televangelists. Some of these names you will remember. One of the first, and probably one of the most important, is a guy by the name of Robert Schuller. He was one of the most infamous of the televangelists. You remember he preached from the Crystal Cathedral in Garden Grove, California, and he was the guy that cussed out the airline stewardess because he didn't get what he wanted on his flight somewhere, and it became national news. And eventually, when he died, his son took over, and the Crystal Cathedral eventually went bankrupt, and so he had to sell it. And the irony of ironies, the Crystal Cathedral was bought by a group of Catholics. Robert Schuller, however, was one of the first of the great televangelists. In many ways, he and Oral Roberts, the second man, paved the way for this kind of thing. Oral Roberts was one of the fathers of the Pentecostal movement during the 1950s to the 1980s. Oral Roberts was preaching long before the TV came along, but he found the TV to be an excellent way to continue his ideas, preaching a message of physical healing. and establishing Oral Roberts University and Evangelistic Association. If I remember right, it was Oral Roberts who saw a 700-foot Jesus come to the end of his bed and tell him to build that university, if I'm not mistaken. I think that was right. Probably the most infamous of all of the televangelists is a guy by the name of Jim Bakker and his wife Tammy Faye, who had eyelashes that looked like this. Jim and Tammy hosted something called the PTL Club in the 1970s and 80s. And Jim Bakker ultimately went to jail after a series of unethical and illegal financial dealings with the club's money. He and his wife divorced. She died of cancer not too long after they divorced, but he got out of prison, and guess where he went? Right back to the TV. And you can buy his buckets of pre-made food in case the apocalypse shows up. He's selling those on TV. Probably one of the most influential of the televangelists, though, outside of Jim Bakker, was a guy by the name of Jerry Falwell. Now, Jerry Falwell was a leading televangelist and political figure of the 1980s. He wasn't only a televangelist, but he had also established something called the Moral Majority, which was a political movement designed to put Christians into public offices, particularly president, representatives, and senators was really where his concern was. But Falwell also established Liberty University, which, as you know, is a fundamentalist school, and he was responsible for overseeing the PTL Club after the Bakkers fell from grace. He took it on. He took it over. In fact, he had had a number of specific dealings with the Bakkers during the 70s in all of this, and managed to stay clear of the scandal himself, but it didn't completely not touch him. Another, which is a hugely popular Pentecostal evangelist of the 1970s, was a man by the name of Jimmy Swaggart. Jimmy Swaggart was Billy Sunday on steroids, okay? Billy Swaggart sweat so much, I thought he was going to drown some of the times that he was preaching. He would bounce around the stage, yelling and screaming, and all the kinds of things that he did. But Swaggart fell into several sex scandals in the late 1980s, and it cost him his career as a televangelist, and he pretty much disappeared from public view. But the one guy, there is one other televangelist, there's a number of others like T.D. Jakes, Benny Hinn, Kenneth Copeland, Peter Popoff, Jack Van Impe, Creflo Dollar, Robert Tilton, Ernest Angley, Mike Murdoch, Hal Lindsey, James Robinson, and the list goes on and on. All of those names I wrote down from memory. I didn't even have to go look them up because they were just popular men in the 70s and 80s during my formative years that were on the TV. But probably the man who has been able to straddle the televangelist role and still retain his popularity into the 21st century is a guy by the name of Joel Osteen. Now, Joel Osteen rode on his father's coattails into the role of preacher. His father was a strong fundamentalist preacher in the South, and after he died, Joel took over his ministry. In fact, while his father was preaching, Joel was often working in a sound booth and other kinds of things that became very familiar with the whole technology side of the equation. So when he took over the mic from his father, he figured out that he could do what many of these other men had done. He could build a successful televangelism ministry. But Joel didn't just focus on TV because the man figured out something. He figured out that television wasn't going to continue to be as effective as a medium as many of these other men sort of assumed it would continue to be. And so he branched out a bit and tried working the different edges to his ministry, writing books like Your Best Life Now, which became deeply popular, and then developing a huge mega church in Houston, Texas. He bought the former basketball club's former stadium and turned it into a church. So every time you see that on TV, that's what you're looking at, an old basketball stadium that's been turned into a church. About 20,000 people a week go to his church. It's a massive church. And he's often considered one of the most influential preachers of the 20th and 21st centuries because of this massive following that he has. Now, he's in the camp with all the rest of these in terms of theology, but he figured out that television wasn't going to be his best, wouldn't be as necessarily his best way of being able to develop such a large ministry. And of course, I'm attributing it to him in this, the way I'm speaking. I'm a little bit of nefariety because he's extraordinarily wealthy from all this, to the point where apparently they can find $600,000 in cash in the wall of the men's room at some point. What's that? A plumber found that, that's right. So unfortunately, it wasn't you as the plumber, right? Yeah, right. So, my point in all this is for you to recognize that there was a strong movement that took place through Protestant evangelicalism alongside of the fundamentalist movement, the liberal movement, how the Catholics were responding to the liberal uprising, what the mainlines were doing. There was a strong, heavy influence of evangelicalism through these men. And make no mistake about it, I am absolutely convinced, beyond a shadow of a doubt, and you'll have a hard time unconvincing me of this, I'm convinced that the state of evangelicalism today in modern America has been deeply influenced by these men, to the point where we have, because of the way that the gospel was presented and how these men led this message, brought this message across, and particularly what I think Bonhoeffer would very much call cheap grace, deeply affected the lack of theology in the typical mind of the typical evangelical coming out of the 20th century and into the 21st. I'm not sure I can lay all the blame at Graham's feet. I certainly can't lay the blame at all the feet of these men, but they have something in common. What's in common with them? The common is that they're not preaching a gospel that is leading to a life of discipleship and holiness and growth in the knowledge of the Lord Jesus Christ. They're preaching a gospel that gets you to a place, and that's as far as it goes. As I said earlier, one of the strongest critiques against the Billy Graham Evangelistic Association was the fact that they did very little follow-up in terms of the discipleship of the people who came to the Crusades and were supposedly saved as they made a profession of faith. How many of those people who came through one of those crusades were actively involved in a discipling church 5 years after the crusade? And as I said, even Graham had to admit that it was probably very few. This movement had a very strong impact on evangelicalism. And I would even go one step further to suggest to you that one of the reasons why the church is shrinking fast now is because these kinds of movements planted a thought into the mind of the American evangelical psyche of what the gospel is all about. Evangelicalism is all about your personal belief. What you do with it is up to you. You don't need a connection to the church. Just as long as you get saved somewhere, you don't need a connection to the church. Discipleship, well, we don't really talk about that. And many of these men, like guys like Schuller and Roberts and others, avoided certain topics along the way, such as sin and the need for repentance. In fact, Oral Roberts once said in a very famous interview, he doesn't even use the word sin in a sermon because he says, it's too negative. I don't want to talk about that with people. The diminishment of certain aspects, the rise of ecumenism, as Graham himself had done, along with the flattening out of the theology of these men down to just a few key points, has left the church where? With virtually no substance to itself. Which, if I might just put in a personal comment, is why when people come here, they look at us and go, man, these people are weird. Because we are. What makes us different is the fact that we're actually going to walk up here, and then we're actually going to take out the Bible and preach it to you, and we're going to use words like predestination, which would never happen in the typical evangelical church because it's along the mold here. Okay, so this is one of the effects of the church moving into the modern age. This is one of those movements. You need to think about this movement in order to understand where we are, as all of the various movements that have taken place in the history of the church lead us to this place. Okay? Do you have any questions? Yes. Oh, I'm sure they did. What they would report, however, I can't speak for Sunday because, that was so long ago, it's hard to tell. But we know that Billy Graham himself didn't take much money out of his ministry. He didn't really need to. Unlike the televangelists, he never got rich, I don't think. But at the same time, I don't think he went lacking for anything. How much he was actually worth as a result has never really been published. I don't think anybody's really sat down and thought about it. Does it? Okay. All right. So the answer to your question is about $25 million worth.
Would you consider that like a satanic?
Well, I wouldn't directly call it satanic. What I would say, however, is that the devil, I have said many times that one of the things the devil wants to do is he doesn't want to eliminate the gospel, he just wants to change it slightly. If he can change the gospel from being a if he can change it from being a true on pursuit of holiness by elect people to a moralistic, therapeutic kind of gospel, which seems like the gospel because it uses all the same words, but it really isn't, he'd be perfectly happy. So I think Satan would be wonderfully happy with Graham's ministry in the sense that if what I suspect is true about Graham in terms of his ecumenism, and especially true about these other guys that we talked about, it would be clear that Satan would be going, yeah, that's great. I'm glad you did that because I didn't have to then convince these people to walk away from Christianity. I just locked them into a form of Christianity that isn't really the true thing. I know some people, just as an anecdote to that, I know some people who were saved through a Billy Graham crusade, but never showed any evidence of conversion in the course of their life. Sure, they had gone down, an invitation, prayed the prayer, got the little card, the whole 9 yards, never showed any evidence of faith in their lives. If you're not a church organization that's leading you step by step along the way beyond the moment of conversion, then I think you're missing something. So I'm not sure I'd call it satanic. What I would call it is less than the gospel. Any other questions? Probably in the same genre. Yeah, probably in the same genre. There's always been a sense of revivalism in evangelicalism, and particularly in the Pentecostal arm of evangelicalism. So the televangelists are really coming out of the same kind of mold that is coming out of. So I would say that they're just mirrors of each other.